On South Asia. Welcome to the podcast produced by the Department of Modern South Asian Languages and Literatures, South Asia Institute, Heidelberg.
Hello and welcome to On South Asia. I am Judhajit Sarkar and we are really pleased and delighted to have with us today Dr. Sudhir Chandra. Dr. Chandra is a well-known Indian historian and social thinker whose work over the years has shed considerable light on the cultural, social, and one might also say existential transformations that the Indian subcontinent has undergone during the colonial and post-colonial periods. Dr. Chandra writes in both English and Hindi. His major works include The Oppressive Present, Literature and Social Consciousness in Colonial India, Dependence and Disillusionment, Emergence of National Consciousness in Later 19th Century India. His latest book, Rukhmabai, The Life and Times of a Child Bride Turned Rebel Doctor, published in 2024, recounts the extraordinary journey of Rukhmabai, who defied patriarchal norms to become India's first female medical practitioner. Thanks a lot, Dr. Chandra, for being with us today.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine, Judhajit.
If I could just start off by asking you about the place of literature in your work. I'm thinking in particular of your 1992 book, The Oppressive Present, which I should say that it was my first introduction to your scholarship. Many of us working on modern South Asian literatures continue to return to that book for its sharp insights into the colonized self, as you put it, and the dilemmas faced by the colonial intellectuals in late 19th century India. But you have also turned to literature on several other occasions, which leads one to presume that literature has played a significant role in shaping your approach to the question of social consciousness in modern India. Is that indeed so? Or do you consider literature to be just one among the many sources at the disposal of an intellectual or social historian?
Surely it is one of the many sources. But speaking personally, I feel that literature is the kind of source which no conventional sources of historians can match the veracity of the world that historians want to understand. And that veracity, the veracity which lies beyond facts, that veracity is available to us largely, if not exclusively, in imagination, if you prefer to call it literature. That's my position. I realized this long back when I was doing my BA. One of my subjects was English literature, and my father gave me a very fine book called Study of Literature by W.H. Hudson. And I still remember one statement in Hudson's book. Hudson said, "In history, nothing is true except names and dates. In literature, everything is true except names and dates." Take it with a pinch of salt. After all, great statements do carry an element of exaggeration. I was so struck by this, I never forgot it. But then such is the power of reigning protocols, of disciplines or disciplinary protocols, that despite having been influenced by Hudson's formulation, when I did my doctoral dissertation, I followed all the protocol of my discipline and wrote a book which had so many names, so many dates, so many facts. It was a study of the emergence of national consciousness in later 19th century India. After I had finished that book, a very deep sense of unease seized me. I felt very dissatisfied with what I had learned of what I called national consciousness. And it seemed to me that I needed to do something else. And then a happy accident occurred. I went to a literature fair and there I found a small book on a 19th century Gujarati poet, essayist, Narmad, one of the founders of modern Gujarati literature. And when I read this book, I realized that literature was calling me. That literature would be my guide to understanding the period that I had set out to study. And I also realized that what I called national consciousness could not be isolated from consciousness at large, or let us say social consciousness. So I enlarged my field of study, stuck to the same period, extending it a bit. So after doing that work, I studied social consciousness in colonial India entirely through literature. And what literature taught me was any aspect of social reality can be understood in binary terms. Life is very messy. Human emotions, human actions, human motives are very messy. If you are trying to make sense of them in terms of binary categories, you would never succeed.
And what kind of binary categories you
Black,
have in
white,
mind? Yeah.
Good, bad.
And specifically in the context of the study of late 19th century India, are there specific binaries that you had to encounter?
Yes, okay. No, yeah. For example, every study of Indian nationalism or the Indian national movement has been done in terms of binary categories like moderates and extremists, secular nationalism and cultural nationalism, or secular nationalism and religious nationalism. When it came to the study of social movements or social reform movements, you had either reform movements or revivalistic movements. So reform, revival, extremism, moderation. So these are some of the binary categories.
And you problematize, in fact, all these categories in the oppressive present.
Completely.
Right.
But I could not have done it if I had not gone to literature.
Since you have brought up the issue of veracity and the kind of veracity that one gets to glimpse in literature, but of course we also know that the historians' understanding, or at least the conventional way for the historian to understand the nature of veracity, the nature of truth, has been very different than the kind of veracity, the ambivalent, let's say, veracity that one encounters in literature. And the way that you discussed or talked about your forays into works of imagination, would it be justified to say that what led you to write The Oppressive Present, or your decision to turn to literary works as your source of understanding how social consciousness was undergoing a change in late 19th century India, would it be right to say that there was a certain kind of inadequacy that you felt with respect to how the same questions about social consciousness had been addressed in conventional historiography so far? Did you identify certain loopholes or certain gaps in existing historiography that made you feel that literature was the site which could offer you a different understanding, a different kind of nuance to unpack how the structures were experienced by the people, the colonial subjects, the first generation of colonial subjects who were undergoing that process of transformation?
You seem to be asking a question, but you are actually coming up with a formulation. And this formulation is exactly what has happened to me. It was no ordinary sense of inadequacy. It was a pervasive and a very deep sense of inadequacy, which turned me away from, I could almost have said turned me against, but I can't say that, but turned me away from conventional sources of historians. I wish I had the talent to do with music or with painting what I have struggled to do through literature. And the picture would be so much more nuanced, so much more refined, though, or perhaps so much less satisfying for conventional historians. But that is the kind of truth I'm looking for. The affability of things, the indefinability of things, that is what I think we ought to be looking for. Knowing that these would never be available to us, and yet struggling to get something of that.
If I could nudge you here a little bit, and staying on the topic of the oppressive present still, so there were certain inadequacies that you identified in existing historiography which made you to turn to literature. What did you discover in literature that was not being addressed by the other kinds of social facts that historians were addressing at that time? What made you, in fact, come up with this succinct formulation of the oppressive present? Why did you feel that the present was being felt oppressive by the actors who were living through that time?
Oh, I'm so happy you asked this question. When I started this work, I realized that this post-1857 generation in India.
And 1857, just for our listeners, is the year of what is called the Great Indian Revolt, or used to be referred to as a Sepoy Mutiny in earlier days, when the Indian soldiers in the army, they revolted against.
That is what I have in mind.
Yes.
The brutal suppression of that revolt, or what many Indians would call War of Independence, the first War of Independence, the brutal suppression of that war or revolt or mutiny, whatever you prefer to call it, I call it 1857, to make things easy for myself. So this post-1857 generation of Indians, especially educated Indians, realized that there was no chance of success if you turn to arms vis-a-vis the British. That was clearly understood by that generation, and in fact even by some generations that came after that generation. At the same time, the reality of slavery or subjection oppressed them. Now that sense, what they felt, they were so unhappy with being subject that they wanted to do something. And they knew that armed revolt was not possible. So they thought of other things. And they realized that even though it was incumbent on them to prepare for a future independence, that independence would not be available to them in their lifetime. Now this realization, think of a generation, a whole people is struggling for an ideal that they know will not be available to them in their lifetime. So to have to devote all their efforts, which would bear fruit, in a future that they cannot even foresee. It's just a notion that one day some of our descendants would take advantage, would be beneficiaries of what we are doing today. So that sense, it seemed to me, was conveyed only by oppressed. The oppressed present. So that is one meaning of the oppressed, so far as the book is concerned. But then there is another sense in which I thought, not at the time of naming the book or not at the time of writing the book, but while I was writing, and in fact after I had more or less completed the book, I realized that in some senses even our present is oppressive. It may not be oppressive for me as an educated middle-class Indian, but it will be as oppressive for, let us say, a Dalit, or for not all women, but women of certain
classes
so
or castes.
There would be large sections of population in my country for whom the present would feel, to whom the present would feel as oppressive as it felt to the generation of educated Indians after 1857. So now, when I think of the title, The Oppressive Present, I don't think only of my 19th century ancestors, but I also think of the deprived and the oppressed of my society in my own times. So for me, the word oppressive carries a meaning which has not lived itself out. The meaning continues.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. Here, if I could turn slightly away from the oppressive present to your other works, and this is going to be a broad sort of question, so you are completely free to address it in the way that you would like to, but it is also in continuation of a certain thematic that's already there in the oppressive present, which is about the, let's say, the dichotomy or the dialectic between tradition and modernity, right? And given your long-standing interest in how colonial modernity has shaped or in some ways distorted the ways that South Asians think about the past, about tradition, about culture, and their relation with all of these things, it makes sense that Gandhi has been a very central figure in your work, right? You have returned to Gandhi repeatedly, especially in your Hindi books, in Gandhi's Country, and even more strikingly in Gandhi, An Impossible Possibility, which offers a reflective, historically grounded meditation on Gandhi's moral and political significance, focusing especially on the final days before his assassination. But today, Gandhi, or at least the principles he championed, doesn't seem to have much traction in contemporary Indian society, or politics for that matter, right? So what is it that continues to draw you to Gandhi? Why does Gandhi still intrigue you? And to borrow the language that you use at the end of Gandhi, An Impossible Possibility, hasn't Gandhi become even more anachronistic in today's India, or in today's world for that matter, than he was in his own time?
Well, there is a sense in which what you say would sound true. surely, in terms of his effectiveness, Gandhi during his time was more relevant, more effective than after his death. That is one way of looking at Gandhi. A closer look would force us to modify this. He comes to India in 1915 from South Africa. So it's roughly around 16, 17 that he starts doing things. And the first major intervention he makes is in 1918, the so-called Rowlatt Satyagraha.
Right.
Now, during these 32 years, the last 32 years of his life, Gandhi led three major movements. 1920-22, non-cooperation movement. 1930-32, the civil disobedience movement. 1942, the Quit India movement. These are the three major movements. And these major movements don't last forever. They last hardly for 2 years and in between these movements, Gandhi is relatively quiet. So out of these 32 years, in terms of active participation in politics, Gandhi's participation would add up to, say, 7 years or 8 years. And for the rest, he's either in jail or quiescent in his ashram. So how is it that 1922, when the non-cooperation movement is seen as a failure, whether it was a failure or a success is a debatable issue, but it was seen as a failure, and many within his own party, the Indian National Congress, thought that Gandhi was not relevant, that Gandhi's methods would not work. So I would like to submit that Gandhi cannot be seen in terms of these 32 years as either effective or ineffective. Gandhi has his ups and downs. Towards the end, that is 46, late 46 to 47, Gandhi became powerless. And Gandhi knew that he had become ineffectual. I know we don't have much time, but I'll still tell you what he said on the only birthday that Gandhi had in independent India. How many of us realize that this man fought the British for 32 years? No harm came his way. When his country became independent, he was permitted to live in his country only for 5.5 months, 169 days. So on his birthday, he says, "Brothers and sisters, today is my birthday." What is there to celebrate about it? It is a day of mourning. There was a time when I wanted to live for 125 years. I don't want to live even 100 years now, not even 90. I have entered the 79th year of my life, and that's enough. And I pray to God Almighty to lift me. So the so-called father of the nation, not wanting to live in independent India, it is a measure of what had happened to Gandhi during those last days. Now, having said that, I would also remind you of the fact that when the armies failed, when the police failed, it was Gandhi who succeeded. And finally, in answer to your question, I would say that the world over, not only in India, there is increasing realization of Gandhi's relevance. These are very small movements, no doubt, but significant in their own ways. Now, I need not cite these various small movements. What I want to say is that the world today is moving precipitously towards its end. Not only in terms of the ecological crisis, but also in terms of the kind of politics which is being practiced all over the world. The world was never a more violent place than it is today. So, to give a short answer to your question, I would say that Gandhi was never more relevant than he is today. And Gandhi was never less possible than he is today. It is an irony of human history that we know what is right, we know what is good, and knowing what is right and what is good, we are studiously steering away from that. That for me is in today's terms, the real significance of Gandhi. There are only two options before us. One option is to try and do what needs to be done. The other option is to keep deferring until it is too late.
Absolutely, and one couldn't have put it more cogently. In fact, when I asked you that question, I was fully aware that it's almost impossible to give a short answer to such a question, but I still wanted to hear your thoughts because you are one of those thinkers who have really reflected deeply on Gandhi and his legacy, not just for contemporary India, but for the contemporary world as such. Now, if I could shift gears even more, another major thread in your research has been the intersection of gender and law in colonial India. You explored this theme deeply in your 1998 book, Enslaved Daughters, Colonialism, Law and Women's Rights. And the title already signals the kinds of issues that you are grappling with there. Your most recent book, Rukhmabai, The Life and Times of a Child Bride Turned Rebel Doctor, continues that engagement with patriarchy and the ways in which courageous women, brave women like Rukhmabai negotiated and challenged entrenched patriarchy. Could you talk a little bit about what initially drew you to this field and how did you come upon Rukhmabai as a subject? She's such an incredibly compelling figure. So it would be wonderful if you could also give our listeners a sense of how she lived her life and the kinds of challenges that she was faced with and how she sort of grappled with those challenges.
Now, it's pure accident which drew me to Rukhmabai. I was writing a paper on the birth of the Indian National Social Conference. And as a good historian, I decided to go through the various newspapers of India beginning January 1887 to see when the first idea of the National Social Conference was publicly discussed. I had reached March 1887 when I saw a small editorial in an Indian weekly called The Indian Spectator about a case in which a woman, a girl, was married at the age of 11. For the next 11 years, for one reason or another, she did not live with her husband. And during these 11 years, this girl acquired some education, and her husband turned out to be a good-for-nothing loafer. Now, for 11 years, the man waited to have his wife with him. And for one reason or another, or on one excuse or another, the girl was not sent to him. So after 11 years, in sheer desperation, he filed a case of restitution of conjugal rights in the Bombay High Court. And this girl, now 22, refused to go to her husband. Now you will realize that even today, there are many grounds on which a spouse can refuse to live with her or his partner. But dislike is no reason. And this woman had only one reason, that is dislike. It's not that she couldn't plead poverty, the men's poverty. She couldn't plead her unemployment as a defense. Dislike was the only reason why, and dislike was no defense. And still she resisted and took a principled position, the principled position being that she was married when she was 11 and not capable of giving an intelligent consent to her marriage. So, because she had not consented to that marriage, she refused to be a party to that marriage. Now, this is an argument, very solid argument, which was not acceptable to Hindu society or to Indian society in general, whether it's Parsis or Muslims or Christians in India or Hindus. These were joint families. And marriage was not a contract between two individuals. Marriages were family affairs organized by parents or guardians. Now, if this defense was accepted, if this plea was accepted, then that would be the virtual end of joint family, the virtual end of parental authority.
Right.
Now, luckily for this woman, the first judge turned out to be a very humane person, an Englishman, Justice Pinney, and he found a legal way out. For lack of time, I'll not go into these legal intricacies, but he gave a judgment in favor of Rukhmabai. And the entire orthodoxy, not just Hindu orthodoxy, Indian orthodoxy across religious divisions was up in arms.
So all hell kind of broke loose.
Broke loose, yes. You put it very well. And now it ceased to be a case between two individuals. It became a case between reformers and opponents of reform. To use the category in broad terms. And there were two more judgments. And sure enough, Rukhmabai lost. And then a compromise was effected. I tell you, it's a fascinating case. I wish we had talked only about this. Yeah. Since there's no time,
absolutely.
I don't know. So, at the end of it, the husband accepted 2,000 rupees and waived all his claims.
It's a counterintuitive end, right? Or even anticlimactic, one should say.
Well, it is anticlimactic, Judhajit, in many ways. Even in terms of the fight for reform, fight for women's rights, which Rukhmabai had waged, it was anticlimactic. One would expect a fiery champion of women's freedom to refuse to compromise. But poor Rukhmabai was reduced to a position where she had no way out. Even the reformers, at the end of the day, refused to stand by her. But that also is a complicated story. I have no time for that. But predictably enough, the husband took another wife soon after this compromise. And Rukhmabai, who was 25 by then, left for England to pursue medicine and return as a doctor. So there was nothing premeditated about this interest in Rukhmabai. That editorial in the Indian Spectator, believe me, I read the editorial a second time to make sure that I was reading what I was reading. I couldn't believe that a 22-year-old Indian girl is refusing to go to her husband.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Chandra, it has been a great experience talking to you, and I have many more questions that I would like to ask you, but our time is limited and your corpus is very vast, so we really hope that we will be able to get you again at some point as our guest on this podcast. But for today, this will be the note on which we will bring this discussion to a conclusion. Thanks a lot for agreeing to speak to us on a very short notice. And this was a wonderful conversation, and I hope that our listeners will enjoy this conversation as much as I did.
Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best.
The pleasure is all mine, Dr. Chandra. Thanks a lot.
You've listened to an episode of On South Asia, a podcast by the Department of Modern South Asian Languages and Literatures, South Asia Institute, Heidelberg. Have a look at our other episodes as well. For topic wishes and feedback, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find our email in the description.